And this one in particular, too, something that jumped out as a concern from the Giants side of things. There were a couple starters on the offensive line playing, at least guys who high draft picks, let's say, like John Michael Schmitz, starter. He played a little bit in this game. Evan Neal, debatable whether or not he's a starter, but first round pick, high draft pick, and the line still didn't look very good. And yes, the Jets have a strong defensive line, but I mean, it was undrafted free agent Braden McGregor, 2 sacks. Takk McKinley, who the Jets picked up off the street a month ago, 2.5 sacks. Leonard Taylor, UDFA, 1.5 sacks. Like, yes, these guys have performed well in the preseason and have a chance to make this roster, and we're obviously fighting for a roster spot, but it's not like they were going up against an elite level defensive line. It's guys who are fighting for a spot here, and they had 8 sacks in the game. It gave Tommy DeVito was sacked 8 times in this football game.
Yeah, it was messed up to put DeVito behind that kind of an offensive line, and that performance was really disheartening because even through the other 2 preseason games, we were talking about how Carmen Bracillo, the new offensive line coach, seemed to be having an effect because not only did the first team offensive line look great in that week 2 game against Houston, but even in that first preseason game against the Lions, I thought the backups looked great. Everything just seemed to be more cohesive. So we thought that was Carmen Bracillo's coaching taking effect, but in this final game, that kind of fell flat, and it really just looked like lack of talent all across the board. You mentioned how a couple of those high draft picks played. Ironically, the only 2 high draft picks that were in there on that first team were the 2 players who got hurt. Both John Michael Schmitz and Evan Neal got rolled up on. Both of them injured their ankles. Apparently, neither one of them is injured severely, but what terrible luck is that for the Giants? Like, I just can't believe that's the kind of luck that we have. And looking at Evan Neal, I mean, we discussed that at length yesterday on Fireside Giants. This guy is not an offensive tackle. It is so clear to me that he is a guard. All of his highlights, or I wouldn't even call them highlights, but all of his positive moments in that game were as a run blocker. And I think it's so clear that he cannot play on the edge. That's where he keeps getting beat with speed, but he doesn't get beat with power. Move him to the interior. I think Saturday night's performance really highlighted that, and it's time for the Giants to finally react accordingly and make the change.
Yeah, I just don't know how you can continue to keep trotting him out there with these kinds of performances at tackle. There was some debate when he was coming out whether he would play at guard or tackle, and then which side. And obviously with Andrew Thomas as the left tackle long term for the Giants, it became obvious he was going to play right tackle, and it hasn't gone very well. But he has shown the ability to play inside in the past. And like when you bring in a guy like Jermaine Illuminor, who at least is he an elite right tackle? No, but is he solid and above average, and it could be a good starter for you? Yeah, I absolutely think so. And he would be a significant upgrade over Evan Neal. I think this is really the only choice left. They're doing a disservice to whoever's starting at quarterback if you keep putting Evan Neal out there at tackle. But any concern with either of the injuries for these 2 offensive linemen also?
I'm just concerned about the fact that they suffered injuries just because it's been a trend for both of them. They can't seem to stay healthy, whether it's their fault or not. I know it's bad luck they got rolled up on, but it is concerning just in that sense. But the injuries don't seem to be long term. I think that Schmitz is going to be fine to start week 1, thank God. And Evan Neal isn't going to start week 1 anyway, but I do think he'll be healthy enough to suit up if he needs to. So not overly concerned. But more so watching that offensive line get berated, the Giants offensive line I was more so impressed with the performance of the Jets defensive line. And again, like you said, it wasn't starters. There was a lot of backups still working the Giants offensive line. But guys like Leonard Taylor and, Takk McKinley, they had really standout performances. And for the Giants, from my perspective, and hopefully from the perspective of Joe Schoen, you're looking at that defensive line saying a couple of those guys might shake free this week. Maybe tomorrow afternoon, a couple of them hit the waiver wire. I think that the Giants getting that final opportunity to scout them in a game setting against their own players might lead to some sort of waiver claim being put in if a player does shake free on the waiver wire.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking at what the Jets defensive line did, the names that I brought up who really stood out, Takk McKinley, Braden McGregor, Leonard Taylor, and with how Takk McKinley has played in this preseason and training camp, he almost feels like a lock to make this roster. But the other 2, Braden McGregor and Leonard Taylor, you'd love to keep them, but it's just a numbers game. And we'll get into it a little bit more in the second half of the show when we go over, 53-man rosters and decisions. But if one of McGregor or Taylor or even both, depending on what happens, if they don't make the initial 53, to your point, I think the Jets are going to have a really hard time getting them through waivers and to the practice squad because I don't know how, like, especially if you're Joe Shane and the Giants, I don't know how you could watch what this defensive line just did to you. And again, granted, it was backup players, but still the performance that they did in this game, and not only this game, but in the two leading up to it and what they've put on tape this summer, and not look at it as a potential upgrade to some of your own depth on the team.